What we're talking about now is presidents and politics in the progressive era. In this presentation, we're going to continue on with some additional issues that took place during that progressive era, late 19th century. This includes two Supreme Court cases, Plessy v. Ferguson and the Wong Kim Ark case. We'll continue on talking about Grover Cleveland, William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft. We'll talk very briefly about third-party politics. This includes the Bull Moose Party. And then I'll complete with a political revolution. That is to say, the political parties will emerge as they are today. And that will happen just before the 1913 election at the end of the Taft administration. Just a little bit of image analysis here. You can see that the lead-in slide has a lot of cartoons, separate but equal. That's Plessy v. Ferguson. On the upper right is another Thomas Nast cartoon. It's about the Chinese and how they're being excluded from liberty. Then there's some political cartoons. You can see Theodore Roosevelt down there in uniform as the vice president, and he's riding into victory after the Spanish-American War, 1898, and sitting on the saddle horn is William McKinley as the president. Then you can see William Howard Taft. He's got that ink pen, and if you look closely, it'll say conservatism on the ink pen, and everybody's cheering about that. So again, it's during William Howard Taft's administration that the parties changed to the way they are today. Last but not least, you'll see a new magazine that had emerged at the time called The Judge, and there will be a scandal during Grover Cleveland's administration, and we will discuss that. But let us start then with Plessy v. Ferguson, and then we'll move on to the Wong Kim Ark case. Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. On all Supreme Court cases, I give you the same methodology, the same mechanism to approach a court case. And so in your note-taking, please write down this basic outline. It's number one, it's going to be the background. Then skip 2 or 3 lines. And it'll be one side of the case. In this case, Plessy's side. And then skip 2 or 3 lines, and it'll be Ferguson's side. He is going to be the defendant here, which is the state of Mississippi. I'm sorry, the state of Louisiana. Then skip a couple of lines and for Ferguson's side, and that will be the outcome of the case. The next thing will be the outcome of the case. You'll only need one line for that, which is who won and who lost. But then the rest of it will be taken up with what does this mean to history? Now, in the Plessy case, I have 2 slides for it, this one and the next one. And the next one will be all about image analysis. But let's start with the background. Now, most of this is not on the slide here, so you just have to write down what I'm telling you. The background of the case goes like this. We've talked about these black codes and Jim Crow laws and how they permeated the South. In this particular case, the state of Louisiana. So the state of Louisiana required the railroads that went through Louisiana to have an extra railroad car for African Americans, just in case African Americans, black people, wanted to ride the railroads. Now, as it turns out, the railroads did not want to do that. They found this to be extremely inefficient. Please write that down. The railroads have to comply with the law. But they don't want to because it's extremely inefficient to have an additional passenger car on the off chance that a black person might want to try and, go someplace on the railroad. And since African American railroad use was really, really, really low, they were having to carry around this extra railroad car to no evident reason. And the state of Louisiana wouldn't let them say, okay, well, we'll partition off a place on a white railroad car for African Americans. We'll partition that off. That was not acceptable to Louisiana. You had to have a completely separate railroad car. And so the railroads didn't like it. Now, separate from that is Homer Plessy and a team of individuals. And they're not working for the railroads, and they're not working on behalf of the railroads, but they know that they might get support, widespread business support, and widespread public support for their cause, since they know that this extra railroad car is very troublesome. So in other words, they might get conservative aid, they might get conservative sympathy for their cause because the railroads are having to carry this extra railroad car at huge expense, and that's inefficient. And conservative politicians they were willing to side with the railroads. But Homer Plessy and a small team chose to challenge these black codes and Jim Crow laws. That's critical. Homer Plessy was not working alone. He had a team of lawyers and individuals, advocates, who want to challenge these black codes and Jim Crow laws. Continue on with strong notes. Now, this is all very technical, so make sure you make clear notes on this. In order to challenge the law, one has to be arrested. You have to actually break the law and get the state, in this case Louisiana, to respond to your breaking the law by arresting you under that law. Then you can challenge it. And so, finally, we're on the slide here. With all that background in mind, we're on the slide here. The first bullet point. Homer Plessy boarded and rode a whites-only railroad car. Well, he went out and got a ticket like anybody else would. But he got onto the whites-only car and sat down, and the train eventually left the station. Off they went. Now, for those of you guys who've never ridden on a railroad as transportation, it's at that point that the conductor comes along and punches your ticket. And so, at that point, strong note now, Homer Plessy had to self-identify as an African American. I'll have his picture up in just a moment. Homer Plessy had to self-identify as African American. That is to say, he was 7/8 white, but still colored by Louisiana standards. Now, what I'm about to say is racist. I'm aware that it's racist. This is for education. This is a really horrible standard that was widespread at the time, and it's called the one-drop rule, which is racist. And the one-drop rule suggests that if anywhere in your family history you had one drop, even a little bit of African blood in your family history, in your ancestry, anywhere, then you were black. And so clearly this is white supremacist. I hope everybody sees that. It's perfectly obvious. White supremacists were going for white, pure white only. If you were, you had to be, in other words, to be a white person in Louisiana, you had to be 100% Northern European. So he identified as an African American, and so he was told to leave the car, that he had to get out of that car and go to the blacks only car. Well, he refused. Now, again, the railroads don't want to have this extra car, but they're working independently towards the same goal as Homer Plessy. At any rate, the conductor said, well, listen, at the next railroad station, we have to stop, go get the sheriff, have him come and arrest you. And Homer Plessy, obviously, he said, yes, that's what I want. To be clear, instead of the conductor saying, well, we're going to let it go this time and not arrest you, but don't forget, you got to get in the black car next time. No, that's not what happened. The railroads went ahead and went through with it. They made the sheriff come in and make the arrest. So Homer Plessy then sued, and the state of California, the state of Louisiana, had to respond to that. He was given a fine or whatever the case may be. That's not material to the case. He was found guilty of having violated this law, this Jim Crow law, and so he sued and said, I disagree with it. Now, the case becomes Plessy v. Ferguson through a technicality unique to Louisiana. In other words, it should have been Plessy versus Louisiana, but it wasn't. The state assistant attorney general was named Ferguson, and so it became Plessy v. Ferguson. Strong note now, it went through the normal court hierarchy. It went through every stage. It went to the local courts, Then it went to the state court, then the state court of appeals. Then it went to the federal court and the federal court, circuit court of appeals. Then it went to the Supreme Court. And this is highly technical, but each side, one side or the other, would always demurrer, D-E-M-U-R-R. Demurrer means that they would legally disagree with the outcome of the case. Then it could be appealed further on. Again, all these Supreme Court cases have a technical side to them. So one side or the other demurred and finally got to the Supreme Court. And here the Supreme Court made a spectacularly bad decision. So rather than judging the case on the merits of the law, the Jim Crow laws or the black codes, they judged it on, did it violate federal law? And so the constitutional position was separate but equal does not violate the 14th or 15th Amendment. And so segregation is not itself an unlawful infringement. Well, that's not what the 14th Amendment suggests. And that's certainly not what the 15th Amendment suggests. The 15th Amendment is all about giving black people the vote. Well, Homer Plessy obviously did not vote for these black codes or Jim Crow laws. And for the most part, in Louisiana, the vote was taken away from African Americans in one way or another by black codes and Jim Crow laws. We've already seen that. The 14th Amendment gives African Americans citizenship. The rest of the law is very technical in its nature, but it doesn't touch upon black codes and Jim Crow laws. So, in effect, strong note now, the Supreme Court punted. They overlooked the Jim Crow laws and black codes and said, well, you know, you're getting the same services as you were if you'd been a white person, so you're okay. Well, that's not true. African American services, you know, drinking at a water fountain or eating at a restaurant or traveling by rail, all those were, they may have been separate, but they were certainly not equal. Louisiana was not making that standard. And so this was it's duplicitous on the part of the Supreme Court. But I do want to draw your attention to the single dissenting opinion. There's 9 justices on the court, and one of them, John Marshall Harlan, dissented. So it's an 8-1 decision. And that's the one I really want you guys to focus on. John Marshall Harlan said the Constitution is the law of the land. That's Article 6, Paragraph 2. And it is colorblind. Now you can see that ellipsis there. That means that he's saying a whole lot more in his opinion. But he goes on to say segregation is a badge of servitude, which was true. In other words, you're African American, you have to go over here. You can't go over here and do this. You have to go over there and do that. You can't drink at this water fountain. You have to drink at that water fountain. You can't go to this bathroom, which is indoors and is clean and is neat. You have to go outside to an outhouse. So you still have a bathroom that you can go use, but one is spectacularly bad, going outside to an outhouse. Those are nasty. And you can't go to the one inside, which is nice and clean and modern. You can't do that. So John Marshall Harlan was right. Segregation is a badge of servitude. And he goes on to say, and this is important, the case would equal Dred Scott in the magnitude of the mistaken decision. Dred Scott, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who don't know, is the worst court case in American history. 1858, the Chief Justice at the time was Roger B. Taney, and Roger B. Taney overstepped the boundaries of the case in Dred Scott. Dred Scott strips citizenship from all African Americans. So states like Rhode Island and Massachusetts and New York had been granting citizenship to African Americans since the Revolution, since the 1770s. And Dred Scott comes along in this case, and the Chief Justice, John Marshall Harlan, Roger B. Taney, I keep making that mistake, I don't know why, Roger B. Taney says, no, the states can't grant citizenship. And so he took citizenship away. He does not have that power. The Supreme Court does not have that authority. They cannot of themselves take citizenship away from anyone. So Dred Scott was the worst case in American history and led, in my view, directly to the Civil War, which was just 2 years later. Everybody at the time was talking about Dred Scott and how terrible of a court case it was. So John Marshall Harlan here in 1896 is saying, listen, this is as bad as Dred Scott, which is true. So the last bullet point, he was right, inequality till Brown v. Board in 1954. So this is Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, 1954-1955. And we will talk extensively about Brown v. Board. So, in effect, strong note now, Plessy lost the case. That's the outcome of the case. Plessy lost. The major part of the Supreme Court is upholding Louisiana's right to make laws the way they want them made. Vox populi, the voice of the people. And that's really a 10th Amendment point of view, which in this case is spectacularly bad. Plessy had argued that this segregation is illegal. You're identifying a minority group and putting them under special legal constraint. And that's reprehensible. That's repugnant to the Constitution. You can't do that. But the court punted, and so Plessy lost. So what does this mean to American history? Strong note now. What the Supreme Court is suggesting is that all of these black codes and Jim Crow laws are in fact constitutional, which is untrue. They are not constitutional. The case can be made that they were arrived at in a constitutional fashion, but even that has a problem. In other words, the people of Louisiana in this case did vote for segregation. They did. But it was a time when African Americans were systematically being deprived of the vote. Had African Americans, freed blacks in Louisiana in the post-Civil War era, been able to vote, they would have voted it down, obviously. But they did not have the vote, or the vote was taken away. So the Supreme Court is upholding these Jim Crow laws and black codes, which are, in broad terms, very, very unconstitutional. And this means that African Americans are going to be oppressed by the law until after the 1950s. Now, you don't have to write this down, but don't forget about it. Later on, when we do talk about Brown v. Board, that will overturn Plessy v. Ferguson. That is in the judgment of Brown v. Board in 1954. And so in the 1960s, we're going to have to deal with civil rights. And that is actually moving forward, African Americans and white Americans, as it turns out, moving forward to remove all these black codes and Jim Crow laws from the books. Brown v. Board was going to find all those laws to be unconstitutional. Again, you don't have to write this down, but don't forget it. It's not the African American community in the 1960s who are reacting violently. They're not. They embrace nonviolence uniformly. The people that are reacting to the judgment in Brown v. Board and they're reacting to that negatively and violently, that will be the white community. They're the ones that are reacting negatively and violently. All right? So we're not done with Plessy v. Ferguson. We're going over it now because we're going to have to revisit it all the way down in 1954, 1955. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at some image analysis. So first, I want you to take a look at Homer Plessy. That's him on the left side of your slide there. That's Homer Plessy. Now, I do have a little star by his name there, a little asterisk. If you look up Homer Plessy, if you take a look and see if you can find an image of him online, I'm terribly sorry to say this, but it's perfectly true. There are websites out there that dispute that this is Homer Plessy's photograph. They try to say that this is actually a governor of Louisiana from about the same time in history, in the 1890s, named Pinchbeck. And Pinchbeck he had a mixed heritage as well. But if you take a look at Pinchbeck and then you take a look at this photograph, then you're like, those are two separate people, clearly and unambiguously. That's absolutely two separate people. Furthermore, Matthew Brady is the one that took this photograph, and on the back of the photograph, he wrote on there, Homer Plessy. So this is Homer Plessy. Now, what's important about this image? First off, does everybody see, hopefully you can see, why he had to self-identify as an African American? But this makes him an excellent candidate for the court case. In other words, he's saying, listen, I'm clean cut, I appear white to anyone else, I'm well dressed, I comport myself well, and yet I'm being segregated out, I'm being maltreated. So if you can do that to me, you can do that to anyone. That is the point that he's trying to make here. That's why Homer Plessy is such a good test candidate to challenge these Jim Crow laws and black codes. He's saying, listen, I look to anyone else like a white man. But because of this stupid one-drop rule, I'm being maltreated. And that's not right. If you can do it to me, you can do it to anyone. So let's do a little bit more analysis. Take a look at the Brewer Court. Now, the photograph is not very large there, but surely you can see how old do you think these guys are? These guys are in their 70s, 60s, 70s. As it turns out, Mr. Brewer, Justice Brewer there in the middle, with his foot up on a little stool there, on a little cassock there, he's going to die the very next year of old age, and then we're going to get the Gray Court, which we'll talk about with the Wong Mark case. What am I driving at here? I want you guys to think. All I ever want you guys to do is think. What had these guys been doing 30 years before while the Civil War was ongoing? I cannot suggest to you that some of these men were actually in the Civil War. Probably not. I don't think so, but it's possible that some of them were actually active in the war as combatants. But certainly as younger men, lawyers, they had seen the Civil War. They'd seen what had gone on and what had happened. This catastrophe that overtook our nation in the middle of the 19th century. And every one of these men knew that if, strong note now, if these black codes and Jim Crow laws were overturned, the South would simply want to resume combat operations. They would rebel again. That was their fear. That was their anxiety. So in judging the case, they didn't judge the merits of the case. They certainly didn't judge the merits of the Jim Crow laws or black codes, which are obviously unconstitutional. They said, well, you know, Homer Plessy, your rights weren't really violated, which was untrue. They punted. They found some torturous argument so that they would not have to face the truth. However, John Marshall Harlan, that's him in that lower right, he was right. He was correct. He called it the correct way. His dissenting opinion, his challenge to everybody else says, the Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates class among our citizenship. But that's true. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates class among our citizens. That's perfectly true. He was right. He called the case correctly. But his was not the point of view that prevailed. And so, once again, ladies and gentlemen, we have to contend with these black codes and Jim Crow laws until the 1960s, which is what makes Plessy v. Ferguson so very important to American history. With that in mind, let's take a look at another Supreme Court case, and that will be the Wong Mark case. So, the Wong Mark case, the United States versus Wong Mark, 1898, 2 years later. Now, your outline is the same. Background, give yourself a couple of lines in your notes for the background. a couple of lines for, basically we're going to talk about Wong Kim Ark's case. We'll talk about him first, the defendant, and then California side, which is the plaintiff here, and then we'll talk about the outcome, and then we'll talk about what it means to American history. So the background. Wong Kim Ark, now I told you you were going to need this when we talked about it before in Western migration, and now you need it. So if you need to go back to your Western migration notes, feel free to do that. But I told you that the Chinese were a different case in immigration, that they had a slightly different dynamic when they came to America. The Chinese wanted to come to America, get rich on gold and silver, and then go back to China. When we took a look at some image analysis at the time, I suggested to you that the Chinese were always wanting to self-segregate. They wanted to, kind of stick to their own people. They had their own habits, their own language, and they just, self-segregated. That is not illegal, and it's not unconstitutional. You can do that. So Wong Kim Ark's parents fit that exact model. Please write that down. They came to America from China on the premise that they could get rich in gold and silver, and that did not work out. So, being industrious, they set down roots. They began a series of businesses, dry goods stores, and cleaning operations, clothing operations in and around San Francisco. And they were very industrious, and they worked it all out, and they started making money. Well, they had a child, Wong Kim Ark. So Wong Kim Ark was born in America. So with that background in mind, let's continue on. Now we're still on background. He traveled to China on several occasions. Strong note now. He knew, as a young man, he knew that to avoid re-entry into the United States, he had to get documentation showing that he was a citizen of the United States. And so before he left to go to China, he got a series of documents from white people saying that, yes, he was in fact from San Francisco. He was from California, that he'd been born there, that he'd lived there his whole life, and that he was a good citizen, which was all perfectly true. But he had to get all these notes and affidavits from white people. He had to get all these eyewitness accounts. He goes to China. He's really looking for a wife. He comes back to America, and he did this once. I think he was 17 or 18 years old at the time. And they were like, okay, yeah, you have all these notes and documents. That's fine. Come on back in. You're a citizen. But he went back to China on a second voyage, on a second vacation, really. Came back. Again, he had all the documentation he needed. But California began to really crack down on the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882. And so Wong Kim Ark was denied entry into the United States. Well, there he was in the port of San Francisco, his home. He could actually see his home from the harbor. He's like, listen, I live over there. I was on vacay back in China. There's nothing wrong with that. I have all these documents saying I'm a citizen. What's the problem? So to make a long story short, Wong Kim Ark went out and got a lawyer. His family got a lawyer, and there was a court case. He was allowed entry finally, but there was this court case. So that leads us to the Chinese Exclusion Act. In other words, to be clear, Wong Kim Ark's side, with that background in mind, Wong Kim Ark's side was he was born in the United States, and so he's a citizen of the United States. And he should be able to go back and forth to China as much as he wants without having any trouble re-entering the United States of America. That should not be a problem. But California had passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882. Now, California, and that's essentially the United States, they make the case that the Chinese are a society apart, and they retain their Chinese identity, and thus are not citizens. More to the point. Strong note here. I didn't write it down on the slide, so more to the point. California tries to make the case that Chinese people, wherever they're born on planet Earth, are subjects of the Emperor of China and therefore cannot be citizens of the United States. Dual citizenship, they weren't going to go for that. I'll say that again. California was making the case that no matter where a Chinese person is born or under what circumstance they're born on planet Earth, they are always going to be subjects of the Emperor of China. Strong note here. The Emperor of China, who in this case happened to be a female, so Empress of China, Xi, Xi, she was not making that case. Wong Kim Ark and their lawyers inquired about that, and they were like, no, we're not making that case. If you were born, the Chinese were saying, if you're born in America, you're an American. That's what the Chinese were saying. Again, this court case goes to the normal court hierarchy. It goes through the California courts. It goes to the State Court of Appeals. It goes to the Federal Circuit Court, the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, and then it goes to the Supreme Court. So when it gets to the Supreme Court, strong note now, when it gets to the Supreme Court, the Gray Court, Brewer is dead by this time, the Gray Court agrees with Wong Kim Ark. Wong Kim Ark won. Strong note now, Wong Kim Ark was using, and his lawyers were using the 14th Amendment. Now this is an odd way to use the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was designed to give African Americans citizenship and therefore overturn the Dred Scott case, which we just talked about. I'll say that again. The 14th Amendment overturns Dred Scott and allows African Americans to be citizens of the United States. It provides for birthright citizenship. It says if you were born in America, the 14th Amendment, if you were born in America, then you're a citizen of the United States. That's the way it is. And today we all agree with this sort of thing. But it took the 14th Amendment to give black people citizenship, and it took the Wong Kim Ark case to give everybody else of any other ancestry, Hispanic or Chinese or Japanese or any other ancestry, also they have birthright citizenship. If you're Canadian and you happen to be born in the United States, your parents were Canadian, but you happen to be born in the United States, well, then you're a citizen of the United States. Unless your parents say otherwise, unless they do something else. Now, the court did make a very odd decision. Strong note here. It was California that had initiated the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882. Now, this was later adopted as federal law, but at the time, it was California law. Strong note here. The law itself is unconstitutional. The law is unconstitutional. California or any other state cannot make immigration law. That is unconstitutional. Article 1, Section 1, Article 1, Section 8, Article 2, I think Section 3, Article 6, Paragraph 2, all of them say that immigration law is a federal power alone. The states cannot make immigration laws. A modern example of that, I guess about 5 or 6 years ago, I don't know, 10 years ago, whenever it was, Arizona was having very serious trouble with illegal immigrants. And so they concluded, Jan Brewer was the governor at the time, and she and the the legislature of Arizona concluded that they had to write an immigration law because Congress was not doing their job, which was true. But the the Attorney General of the United States went over to the Supreme Court, got an amicus brief, a friendly letter, took it to Arizona and said, listen, you cannot make an immigration law. If Congress is not doing their job, Well, elect a Congress that will. Change your representative, change your senator. But just because Congress is letting you down does not allow you to write immigration law. It's unconstitutional, which is true. So Arizona in that case did not get what they wanted. Here, the gray court is allowing the law to stand. And it stays until 1943, as you can see there. Now, I challenge everybody, think what was happening in 1943 that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president at the time, wanted to get rid of that law. Well, World War II was going on at the time. And the Chinese were our allies. Now, this is cogent to the case. The leader of China at the time, Chiang Kai-shek, confronted the allies, his ally, the United States, and said, listen, by the way, you're wanting us to do all this fighting for you, and you wanted us to help you against the Japanese, but you guys are racist. The Chinese, I cannot overemphasize this, the Chinese government at the time of the Wong Kim Ark case very deeply resented these racist laws. They knew what these laws were at the time, and they were racist against the Chinese. Later on, Japanese people will be able to come to America because they're not Chinese. That'll happen later. But Chinese could not come to California. They couldn't come to the West Coast, really. And the Chinese really deeply resented that because they knew it was racist. But then, when we needed the Chinese during the war, then we went back and got rid of this law, which was unconstitutional from the start. So with that in mind, let's go take a look at some image analysis. Now, we will be spending some time on this, so settle in. So here then are some images associated with the Wong Kim Ark case. Up in the upper left, that is our man, Wong Kim Ark. If you Google him and put a Google image on there for Wong Kim Ark, that's usually the picture you're going to come up with. I think there's several others. This is the one I used. So what's really going on here? Let's take a look at some of these other cartoon images. Go down to the lower right. At the time in California, in the 1890s, really emerging in the late 1880s, but in the 1890s, there was a popular ticket, and it's called the Working Man's Party of California, the WPC. Now, take a look at the image there. It is really, really deeply racist. You see this leg with a big giant boot on it, kicking this Chinese person right in the butt. And on the, at the lower part of the slide there, the image there, it's California, and you see the California bear there. A little teddy bear looking thing. But there's this pair of legs with this big giant boot. That's the WPC, the Working Man's Party of California. And their only cause is that it says right there that Chinese must go. It's kicking this Chinese person into the Pacific Ocean and back to China. In the center of the slide here, you can see a colored image there, and the magazine that it came out of, and you can see it right in very tiny little print right above the central, the middle of the slide, the middle of the picture there. It came from a magazine from the time called a WASP. Now, the WASP is an acronym, and it stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, which means that it is overtly racist. WASP is White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And this is the Working Man Party of California. This is their publication. So again, you see the phrase there, the Chinese must go. But then it asks a question, but who keeps them here? And you can see in all the small parts of the image there, it's kind of hard to make out, I know, but it's white people patronizing all of these Chinese businesses. The Chinese are running stables, they're running cleaning businesses, laundries and things like that. They're running dry goods stores. They're running bathhouses. They're running all these service-oriented businesses, sewing and cleaning and food preparation. They're running all these businesses for white people. So the WPC is saying, you white people, you've got to stop patronizing all of these businesses run by the Chinese. Now, in the very middle of that image there, you can see the head of a donkey, again, is braying and yelling, and it's wearing a hat, a Commodore's hat. And it means that the Democratic Party is in charge. Now, we've talked about this before, and it's genuinely unfortunate. The conservatives were doing what the WPC, the Working Man's Party of California, wanted done. In other words, the WPC is a white supremacist organization. They're overtly and absolutely saying that. They're claiming that. And the Democratic Party, the Conservative Party, is doing what they want done. Now, on the left, we have one more image. Really quickly, let me go over this. Now, there again is Thomas Nast. If you look down in the lower right corner, you'll see this Chinese person leaning against a light post. And just above his head is the phrase, is Thomas Nast's signature. So again, this is a Thomas Nast cartoon. And I've said that this guy is like really amazing in his ability to call what's going on. Take a look at the caption. Let the Chinese embrace civilization and they may stay. Now, this is a very insightful cartoon. In the center, you see a Chinese person, hanging onto a whiskey bottle. If you go down to the very bottom of it, it's beg, 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 I'm starving, and it's this person that's overweight who's plainly not starving, he's eating. Moving clockwise, high wages and no work. Strike, strike, strike. Go up one, and it's vote, 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 vote. We've already talked about how it was relatively easy to cheat at elections. Go up one to the upper left corner, you can see they're boxing. Well, pugilism, boxing, that was a huge blood sport at the time. So they got to fight, 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 fight. Then they got to cry out for no rent, no rent, no rent. Then they've got to go around a little bit, and you go to the Senate, and you talk, 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 talk. Go down, you go to the rum hole, and you loaf, 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 loaf. That's a phrase nobody uses anymore, but you loaf around. You don't do anything. Last but not least, you get drunk, and you drink, 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 drink. That chap that's leaning up against the light pole. So what is Thomas Nast saying? Let the Chinese embrace civilization and they may stay. That's what white people were doing. They were striking, they were voting, they were boxing and beating each other up. They were doing all these terrible things, conducting themselves in a very negative way. And if the Chinese would simply do that, then they could stay. It's a joke, it's ironic, it's satire. So what were the Chinese doing? This is what Thomas Nast is implying. They were hardworking, they stayed clean, they were honest. If they were going to gamble, they would gamble in their own little way, in their own little gambling halls, usually on a game called Mahjong. I have no idea how to play Mahjong. I've tried time and time again to figure that game out. I can't. If they want to get inebriated, then they use the drug of choice is opium, which was legal at the time. But they stayed a society apart, and they were clean, and they were hardworking, and they minded their own business. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, they were model citizens, as immigrants always are. Immigrants want to fit in. They don't want to be a society apart. Immigrants invariably come to America, they take a look around, and they say, well, how should I dress? How should I conduct myself? What should I do so that I don't draw attention to myself? It's always that way. And so the Chinese do not want to draw attention to themselves. They want to work hard. Even, I refer you back to that center image, even the Working Man's Party of California was acknowledging that. Here the Chinese are in this hard, backbreaking, thankless task in all these little industries, the service industry, running stables, running laundries, running bathhouses, running, takeout food places, doing sewing and cleaning, and they're making money at it. They're making a little bit of money at it. They're hard, industrious, hardworking people. And white people are perfectly happy to make use of those services. But for reasons of racism, the Working Man's Party of California wanted to throw them out. So, in conclusion, what am I driving at? Racism and identifying minority groups and taking their rights away was not simply confined to the South. It wasn't being directed just against African Americans. So in the Northeast, the Irish, they had to put up with it. We've already seen that. They had that same sort of dynamic. Later on, as more immigrant groups come in, the Germans are going to get a little bit of it. The Jews will get some of it. The Poles will get some of it. The Italians will certainly get some of it. That will happen in the Northeast. In the upper Midwest, in the Midwest, and in the Plain States, it's going to be the Native Americans. You know, you have a saloon or something, there'll be a sign out there, no dogs and no Indians. And so they're the ones that got all this hatred applied to them. On the West Coast, it's going to be the Chinese. America has always, always, always had a problem with racism and this continuing dynamic of identifying minority groups and putting them under a special legal constraint. I'm not trying to be preachy with you guys. I'm saying that there are imperfections in our interpretation of the Constitution. That is the critical issue here. Now, with all that in mind, let's finish up then with the Wong Kim Ark case. I'm done talking about it. Let's go on and start discussing some of these presidents who are important during the Progressive Era. We will start with Grover Cleveland. Now, before I begin with Grover Cleveland, ladies and gentlemen, I want to point out that we don't have time to talk about all the presidents who held office during this period. We're not going to talk about Garfield, James Garfield. He was shot about 4 months into his presidency and died of an infection a few days later. His vice president was Chester Arthur, and so Chester Arthur is going to take over. We're not going to talk about him either because when he took over, he was simply a caretaker. Garfield was shaping up to be a very good president. He came out of the House of Representatives, and he had an agenda. But then he was shot. Chester Arthur took over as the vice president and elected to become just a caretaker president. He was only in for the one term, and that was it. Then that led to Grover Cleveland. Now, Grover Cleveland's first administration, we're not really going to discuss that. Because again, he exhibited the same habit that many other presidents had exhibited before and was basically a caretaker president. He didn't do much in his first administration. I'm sure he would disagree with that assessment. But then he was unelected. In other words, another president came in, and that was Benjamin Harrison. Now, Benjamin Harrison didn't do anything. He was a nobody. He was a non-entity entity. Again, I don't think he would agree with that. But even if you go to the White House page, there's not a whole lot on Benjamin Harrison. But during that time, Grover Cleveland had a little bit of an awakening. He had a little bit of an epiphany. And he concluded that, quote, "What is the point of being elected if you don't stand for anything?" Please write that down. What is the point of being elected if you don't stand for anything? So, we're really going to talk about Grover Cleveland's second administration. Again, he was in for 4 years, 1885 to 1889, then out for 4 years, then back in 1893 to 1897. Grover Cleveland was a Democrat from Ohio. He's a Northern Democrat. He'll be the first Democrat elected after the Civil War. Strong note here, and this is just a political message. The Democrats are going to be blamed for the Civil War. And there's a lot of support for that political emergence, that political dynamic in the country. It's called the Bloody Red Shirt. You hear it referred to really occasionally, but rarely today, the Bloody Red Shirt. That the Democratic Party, the conservatives of that time, were blamed for the Civil War. And so Grover Cleveland is going to be the only Democrat elected between what would be 1856 to all the way to his election, 1885 to 1889, and then 1893 and 1897. He'll be the only Democrat until we get to Wilson. And Wilson is transitional. he emerges as the president of the Democratic Party that we would understand today. So Grover Cleveland is transitional as well in his own way. In his second administration, he's going to be more activist. Please write that down. He's a Democrat, which means he's a conservative. But unlike most conservatives in American history, he's going to be more activist. And that makes him more transitional. He agrees with what is referred to at the time as a paternal president. That is to say, he sees himself as the father of his country, and he's going to take active measures as a father would. He's going to work for both sides, but he's going to be much more active. So, a strike breaker by force if necessary. Now, we saw that. This is a reference to the Pullman strike. The Pullman strike happened on his watch, and very famously he said, I'm going to send the army in to break up the Pullman strike. As a reminder, that was because it was disrupting the U.S. mail. The big mail carrier was the railroads back in those days. And so he said, very famously and publicly, if it takes the entire United States Army to deliver a postcard in Chicago, that postcard will be delivered. And so he broke up the strike. But at the same time, if you'll recall, he told the Pullman car company, start treating your workers right. Do not, you can't have this economic slavery business. You can't have this debt slavery anymore. And I will nationalize the railroads if I have to, which was a real threat at the time. So here he is exhibiting the power of the presidency, and no one was willing to do that for the most part before. No one had ever done that. He disliked and distrusted trust. Remember that a trust is a byword for a monopoly. We talked about that when we talked about the Sherman Antitrust Act. A trust is a monopoly. So again, he's beginning this movement away from monopolies. He's not going to do it. We'll have to wait for McKinley for that, and we'll get to McKinley in a second. But he's beginning to listen to the voice of the people, Vox Populi. Ida Tarbell had written about this. Upton Sinclair's book was already out. We've had all these trusts, all these monopolies that are out there, and everybody is bitterly complaining about those. The problem with all these strikes were an indication that these monopolies were really, really bad. And Grover Cleveland is starting to agree with that. Yes, they are bad, which is not really the conservative position at all. The conservative position is like, yeah, let market forces decide. But he's publicly saying, no, these monopolies have to go. He's not doing anything about it now. We have to wait for McKinley for that. But he is publicly disagreeing with monopolies. His administration is plagued with panics. A panic is a short, sharp depression. A short, sharp depression. And they called them panics, but there'd be some silly rumor in the stock market, and that would cause the stock market collapse. Now, one of the problems with a true laissez-faire economic model, we've talked about this, and I said don't forget it because you're going to need it. Well, now you do. One of the problems with the laissez-faire economic model is you have a boom and bust economy. And so sure enough, in Grover Cleveland's administrations, you see exactly that. He has one panic after another. Then you'll have a recovery, and then you'll have a panic. And then you'll have a recovery, and you'll have a panic. And so the markets are going up and down and up and down and up and down. And the office of the presidency, they're being held accountable for that to some degree. So this is exactly, economically, what's taking place here is exactly what we would anticipate with a laissez-faire economic model. Bitter personal attacks. I had that on that picture on the lead-in slide. You saw Grover Cleveland standing there, and there was a woman holding a child. Here's the problem. Grover Cleveland went into the presidency in 1885 as a bachelor. He's the only bachelor we'd ever had up until that time. All the previous presidents had been married. Some of them, their wife had passed away, and some were widowers. Thomas Jefferson, for example. But he had never been married. Well, he goes into office and he gets unelected. Benjamin Harrison is in, and while he's out of office, he goes to various receptions. He meets people all the time. He talks to people all the time. And he was talking to a woman, a widow, the wife of his former law partner. And one thing led to another. Well, her name was Folsom, and Miss Folsom, the widow Folsom, got a letter in the mail one day from Grover Cleveland saying, "Hey, you're a very interesting person. I'd like to go on a date with you." Well, upon looking at who the addressee was, it wasn't to the widow Folsom. It was to Frances Folsom, her 19-year-old daughter. So Grover Cleveland was in his 50s by this time, and she was 19. To make a long story short, she did, in fact, go out on this date. And to her dying day, which was in the 1930s, Frances Folsom Cleveland always said that her husband was kind and gentle and forthright and a wonderful conversationalist and an excellent man. He was just a good person. And so they did get married. Him in his 50s, and she was 19, I guess 20 at the time. So why bitter personal attacks? Well, these, spring to December weddings, that's what they're called, where an old guy marries a young girl, that was very much frowned upon at the time. It happened, but it was frowned upon. But that's not the problem, ladies and gentlemen. The problem was that they got married, and 8 months later, there was a baby named Ruth, which suggests premarital sex, which was very, very much frowned upon. Very much frowned upon. And so there was a lot of bitter personal attacks leveled against Grover Cleveland. That happens to presidents, but here was a sexual scandal, and that was at a time when, late Victorian, where nobody did that. Sidebar on this, which you might find interesting, there's an echo in that today that is in every grocery store in America. If you go to the grocery store and you look at the candy aisle, you might find a candy bar called a Baby Ruth. And the Baby Ruth candy bar is not named after Babe Ruth, the baseball player of the 1920s. That's what everybody thinks. No, it's named after Baby Ruth, Grover Cleveland's child by his wife, Frances. And so, next time you're in the grocery store, get a Baby Ruth. They're delicious. A sound economy at the end of his administration. So again, the economy was on and up. But as soon as McKinley takes over, who we're going to talk about in a second, the economy crashes again. Last but not least, and I do want you guys to take a strong note here. Of all the things that you have on this slide, I want you guys to take the strongest note here. He vastly increased the Navy. Now, again, we've got to pull in another thread. And we've talked about this. We talked about Alfred Thayer Mahan. Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. And in that book, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who is should be very much in your notes, suggested that in order for the United States to be important as a nation, we need to have a strong Navy. That Britain had done that, and they were important all over the world. And so the United States needed to do the same thing in order to be an important country. Well, Grover Cleveland, along with a lot of other people, take a look at that very, very important book, and he begins to grow the Navy. Strong note here. A naval vessel is only the outward manifestation of the growth of the Navy. What I want you guys to be thinking about is the issue behind the Navy, the Navy behind the Navy, the issue behind the issue. In other words, to design a modern battleship at that time, when battleships were in transition, you had to have a design team. They were only ever going to design Navy battleships. So they're only going to work for the Navy. Then you have to have construction yards that are only going to build battleships. You can't take somebody off of building merchant ships and say, well, now build me a battleship. That won't work. You have completely different ships, completely different dynamics going on there. And so when we talk about vastly increasing the Navy, you're talking about shipyards and design teams and then training facilities because the sailors have to be trained completely differently. And so the size of the government grows. That is the purpose. That's the whole point here. That's the purpose of this. Grover Cleveland is listening to the American people. He's transitional. He's starting to absorb some of those progressive values. And one of the things the people wanted was a huge Navy. And that means the government is beginning to grow. Please make that sure that that's clear in your notes. It's underlined. Big giant note there. The government is starting to grow. With that in mind, let's talk about the next president, Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland, a Republican, again from Ohio. In terms of his background, McKinley was the last of what are referred to as the Civil War presidents. In other words, Grover Cleveland had been involved in the Civil War. So had Garfield and everybody else, all those other presidents, had been involved one way or another in the Civil War. McKinley had been at the Battle of Chickamauga. Evidently, 3 or 4 miles away from him at that battle was Grover Cleveland. He was involved in that fight as well. But he will be the last president directly associated with the Civil War. He's a Republican from Ohio. He'd been the governor of Ohio for a while. He'd worked in Congress for a while. He'd been a senator. And so he was a very strong lawyer and a political figure of long standing. Now, he got elected not because of, how shall I put this, not because he was a friendly, outgoing man. He was. But take a look at that photograph. And I have it on there in the first bullet point. Colorless personality, but an outstanding politician. And so if you saw that man in the streets, you wouldn't say, well, behold, I'm going to go up there and shake hands with this fellow because he seems like a very friendly guy. He was a very friendly man. He just didn't look that way. What got him elected, ladies and gentlemen, was not really his own personality, which didn't count for a whole lot back in those days, but because the Democratic Party candidate was none other than William Jennings Bryan. And William Jennings Bryan will run into him again later on. He's going to run for president more than any other single individual in American history. And he ran on a religious ticket, which suits the Conservative Party fine. And they're going to embrace that. But nobody wants to run the country through the Bible, which is what William Jennings Bryan was saying. So it's not that the Republicans won the election so much as the Democrats, who were trying to elect William Jennings Bryan, they lost it, which is, the result is the same. So a colorless personality, but an outstanding politician. The phrase that was used about him is not a phrase that we would understand really today. Someone pointed out that he has his ear so close to the ground that it's filled with grasshoppers, which sounds really strange today. But having your ear to the ground, back in those days, and even when I was a young man, that meant that you were listening very intently. It means you were listening. You got your ear to the ground. You're listening. So he has his ear so close to the ground, it's filled with grasshoppers. In other words, he was listening to the people. Vox populi. Here we have full-blown progressivism. Your book will talk about this a lot. It puts McKinley right in the middle of all these progressives. Now, it is my opinion, ladies and gentlemen, that if it had not been for events, which is like one of the bullet points down below, William McKinley would be one of our top 10 presidents, certainly. Today, nobody even remembers William McKinley, which is unfortunate. But I don't know if he would make the top 5, not because he was that bad, but because so many other presidents were that good. Washington, Lincoln, FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, Reagan. We had a lot of really good presidents in between. But certainly William McKinley should be in the top 10. Because, the next bullet point, he begins the era of trust busting. If you will recall, strong note here, when the Sherman Antitrust Act 1890 was put into law, When that bill was passed, it was given no teeth. It had no enforcement capability. That's just the nature of politics. Again, anytime we pass some major legislation, we try and avoid giving any teeth up front. And then over time, as we adjust the law and people get used to the law, then we will finally put teeth into it. Well, here we are. The law's been on the books for over almost 10 years. And so William McKinley begins to put teeth into the law. And he begins the era of monopoly busting. I have up there trust busting. That's what they called it then. He begins this era of breaking up the monopolies. They begin passing railroad legislation. They begin passing tobacco legislation. They start small and then begin to really go for the big ones. They try to bust up big steel. They're going to have a very difficult time breaking up the big banks, but that will also happen later on. So they keep on. They're going to start with this era of trust busting, and that's what people wanted. Please make sure you write that down. People wanted an end to these monopolies. Economically, what we're really talking about here economically, strong note now, is that by breaking up these big monopolies, we're reintroducing competition into our capitalist economy. I will say that again. Please write it down. By breaking up these monopolies, we are reintroducing competition into our capitalist system. Monopolies are capitalism. They're just bad capitalism. Competition is much, much better for all of us. It's better for the economy. Competition is good. American imperialism. Okay, we will actually talk about American imperialism later on, but American imperialism as a dynamic in our politics begins under McKinley. That will be the Spanish-American War, 1898. Spanish-American War, 1898, and we will talk about that later on. Now, he's assassinated in 1901. Strong note now, and don't be confused. Make sure you get this straight in your notes. McKinley had just gotten reelected. He had just gotten reelected. Again, William Jennings Bryan is out there trying to run for president again. It's not going to work. But McKinley's second vice president was Theodore Roosevelt. Now, we'll talk about this more in the very next slide, but strong note here. We have to put it in the right context. Theodore Roosevelt was also running for president on the Republican ticket. He had challenged William McKinley for the presidency. And McKinley outflanked him, you might say, politically. He used an old political trick. He went to Theodore Roosevelt and said, listen, you're not going to get elected, but you're just going to destroy my chances. And that means we're going to get William Jennings Bryan. So why don't you come on and be my vice president instead? That happens all the time. And as my vice president, this is what William McKinley was saying, as my vice president, you'll be the president of the Senate, which is true. And you'll learn the ins and outs. You'll make a lot of friends. You'll get used to government at the federal level. And then at the end of my second administration, this is what McKinley is saying. At the end of his second administration, McKinley's, he'll be out and Roosevelt will be in. Now, again, this happens all the time, and it's very, very smart. That's how you do it. So Roosevelt said, okay. Well, McKinley obviously did not know that he was going to be assassinated. He gets reelected, and he's at an exposition, a world exposition in Buffalo, New York. Now, this is unbelievable, and today we would never do this, but this is true. At this exposition in Buffalo, New York, where everybody's showing off everything, all the states have these big giant presentations, these big giant floats, and all sorts of booths showing what's going on in their state. This is true, ladies and gentlemen. There was actually a booth where you could shake hands with the President of the United States. William McKinley had a booth. And so he shows up to this booth and he's shaking hands with different people. How do you do? I'm the president. Hey, how you doing? Wow, it's really great to meet you. Have a good day. Next. Wow, it's really great to meet you. Hello. Shakes hands. Well, one of the people in line was mentally disturbed. He was shown later on to be basically insane. And he steps up to William McKinley. He had a pistol in his hands. It was covered with a handkerchief. Nobody saw it. Again, we don't have Secret Service back in those days. There was no, no Secret Service agents at all. But this insane individual took the handkerchief off his hand, and there was a pistol, and he shot William McKinley. Again, William McKinley, they thought he was going to make it. It looked like he was going to recover, but an infection set in 2 or 3 days later, and he died. Now, Theodore Roosevelt, was out in New York. He was from New York, and he was on some fishing expedition or hunting expedition. It took him a couple of days to actually find him. He was so far up in the Catskills Mountains. And they had to rush him back, put him on a train, and send him to Washington, D.C. to take over as the president. So for a couple of days there, we had no president at all. And as you can imagine, in that case, I think at that time, the law's changed since. At that time, I think the Secretary of State takes over. And so we had a temporary individual as the president. And then Roosevelt showed up, and he became the president after that. He got sworn in. So with that in mind, let's talk about Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919. He's the president from 1901 to 1909. Now, a few words on his personal background. Theodore Roosevelt was born into a very, very wealthy family. The Roosevelts, there are Roosevelts out there today, and they are wealthy. They had glass manufacturing. They owned a series of hotels in different places, especially throughout New York City. And so they were a very wealthy family. Well, growing up, and I have it up there, he's characterized by rhetoric, but take a look. I have that phrase up there, noblesse oblige. This phrase means the noble obligation. The Roosevelt family was raised with this ideology, with this idea in mind. Noblesse oblige means the noble obligation, and that is to say, the rich, the well-off, have to help other people. It is your duty in life to help other people. That's what you must do. So throughout his life, he will be an advocate of the little man. Always, always, always. He's always trying to identify with the common man. As a young man, he contracted asthma, and that affected him his whole life long. He always had asthma. They consulted doctors. Again, he's really, really wealthy, so they consulted doctors. And the doctor said, well, you have to try to be very physically fit. Well, obviously, any kind of cardiovascular, what we call cardiovascular today, that was right the way out. But a lot of people don't know this about Roosevelt. He did turn to basically what we would call today weightlifting. And so not necessarily bodybuilding, but he did a whole lot with weightlifting. Again, that was a thing even back in the day. So he used a lot of weights, and he did a lot of weight training and stayed very, very physically fit. Today we think of Teddy Roosevelt, and we think of this portly, sort of overweight fellow. Well, that was when he was an older man. That's when he was like in his 50s and 60s. But as a young man, he's really very slender and very, very physically fit. He grows up. He tries to get involved in New York politics as a state representative. That did not work out. He had a very difficult time working as a politician. He would come up with all these really great ideas, things that the ordinary people would want. But then the conservatives in the New York State House would shoot him down. And he recognized there was a whole lot of corruption. Well, he was rich, and so this corruption business, he didn't want anything to do with it. He didn't need the money. And so he really he was trying to exhibit this noblesse oblige and stay out of the corruption. And he just found himself surrounded by criminals and banditos. And he said, well, I don't want anything to do with it. Then Teddy Roosevelt suffered a very, very serious personal tragedy in his private life. He was very close to his mother. His father was something of an alcoholic and died early, which was tragic. But he was very, very close to his mother. Nothing odd about that. He had a love affair with his wife. It was not an arranged marriage of any sort. He genuinely did love her. But a terrible tragedy ensued when his wife and his mother both died in the same house at essentially the same time on February 14th, St. Valentine's Day. They died just hours, perhaps minutes apart. So you can imagine Theodore Roosevelt, this sensitive young man, mid-20s, early 30s, running around trying to figure out what to do because his mother and his wife were dying at the same time. He was witnessing this. Doctors were all over the place, but they couldn't stop it. Well, this affected him, obviously, in his private life, and he always talked about the Blue Devils. The Blue Devils is a metaphor for depression. And so after a while, trying to figure out what to do with his life, he said, all right, you know what, I'm going to go west. I got to get away from this all. I got to get involved in something else. Now, this is sort of a story about him that hopefully will illustrate how Theodore Roosevelt felt about, his common man. Basically, he bought a ranch out west, Montana. And he concluded he was going to go out to the west, escape the Blue Devils, and, try something new. Change the scenery. So imagine, if you will, this guy that had always been involved with the rich, wealthy elite, and he's, New York, and he's going to go out west and try and make a ranch work out there. Well, he goes to New York City, gets some, Western clothing. That's not going to work out. Then the story goes that he went to Saratoga. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, Saratoga is the racehorse capital of New York. That's where thoroughbreds are put together. That's where they're bred, Saratoga, and that's where they're raced. There's a bunch of racetracks in and around Saratoga. So he got a bunch of thoroughbred horses, which are not going to be the same as cow ponies, and they're not going to do very well out in, Montana. It's not going to work. But he didn't know that. Got on a train and went to the west. He telegraphed ahead saying, hey, listen, you guys that work on this ranch, that's my ranch now, meet me at the railroad station. So imagine, if you will, the look on these cowboys' face when they saw Teddy Roosevelt for the first time. Slender, kind of shortish, not very tall. These glasses, he was very nearsighted. He's got these crazy clothes on, and then he gets these beautiful, magnificent thoroughbred horses, race horses, out of the railroad car, He's got crazy saddles. It's not going to work. And Roosevelt recognized that that something was wrong. It didn't take a genius. But the story goes, and this is what's important. He talked to these guys. He talked to the cowboys and said, listen, I know I don't know what I'm doing. But he shook hands with all these guys and he said, listen, I'm depending upon you guys to help me. You have to help me. Please understand what's going on here. I'm going to try and make this ranch work. And here's the situation, and I'm depending on you guys to help me. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's only human. If some guy that clearly doesn't know what's going on is making silly mistakes and needs help, but then he asks you for help, instinctively we do that. So again, this is Roosevelt reaching out to the common man. So he goes back into politics later on. He gets done with this ranching business. Strong note here, we're still on his background. He becomes the Undersecretary of the Navy. This is during McKinley's first administration. He's the Assistant Secretary or the Undersecretary of the Navy. What's important about that is the Navy is going through this huge transition. We just got done talking about that. They're becoming a modern Navy. They're growing. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, Roosevelt wanted to be where the action was. So he gets involved in the Navy. His relation later on, FDR, will do the same thing. We will talk about that with FDR. FDR was a very young man at the time and idolizes his uncle, Theodore Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt goes into the Navy Department. He's where the action's at. He's talking to the guys. He's talking to the workers. Then the Spanish-American War comes along. He got rid of all of his public offices. And as a very rich man, he forms a unit called the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry. They're known by their more common name, the Rough Riders. They were recruited and formed in Texas, as it turns out, in San Antonio. So Roosevelt pays for this unit, the Rough Riders, out of his own pocket. Horses, saddles, bits, uniforms, weapons, equipment. He paid for all that. He had to find a commanding officer, and the guy's going to be named Leonard Wood. Now, Leonard Wood was a retired general in the United States Army, and Roosevelt recruits him as the commanding officer. Now, think that all the way through. Roosevelt says, I'll be the second in command, I'll be a volunteer major, and you be the colonel of this unit. You be the commanding officer. I'll pay for everything. It's all on me. I'll pay for everything. But I don't know anything about an army unit. I don't know anything about training troops or running a military operation. So you be in charge of the unit, and I'll be your second in command. Again, think noblesse oblige. So Roosevelt goes to the Spanish-American War. We will talk about that again later on. And he does really well. He does do very good. His unit is, heroic. They do an awesome job. So he's coming off of that, and with this very compelling personal story, when he runs for president in 1901. And then, as we saw on the previous slide, McKinley usurped him and said, listen, be my vice president. McKinley is shot, so he's in. Strong note here as a reminder. His first 4 years in office are actually McKinley's second administration. And then he will get reelected on his own hook. He'll get reelected on his own efforts. But under the rules of the time, the unwritten rules, the tradition, you can only have two administrations. But does everybody see his first administration was really McKinley's, and he will say so. His second administration is his own. So under the unspoken rules, he can have another administration as well. And that will be important later on. So let's go through this then. Policy, not specific program. His policy was to break up these monopolies, and he gets a strong reputation for breaking up monopolies. We'll revisit that in a minute. But his policy is supporting all of these other programs. Radical acts. Now, these are radical. By establishing the Food and Drug Administration. Those are in turn supported by various laws about food and drug purity. Again, think of The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. That should already be in your notes. It's certainly in the book. Think of The Jungle by Upton Sinclair and this public outcry about pure food and pure drugs. So he establishes an agency within the government to make that happen. This is what progressivism is all about. Vox Populi, the voice of the people. They want these things. Roosevelt's going to do it. So we start getting drugs that actually do what they're supposed to do. You get some terrible form of cancer, and the doctor was just going to say, well, take this medicine, and it turned out it would be rum. It would be nothing but alcohol. But because of the FDA, drugs have to do what these pharmacy agencies say they will do. They have to be tested. And that means the government's going to grow. Meat inspectors have to be put into these packing plants. They have to be selected. They have to be trained. They have to be paid. They have to have rules and regulations governing what is this type of beef or that type of beef or the other. Again, that means the growth of government. He's going to break up trust, monopolies, especially through federal investigation. Again, the growth of government. Government will grow. The Hepburn Act. This is railroad regulations. You can't have monopolies anymore. You have to standardize freight cost. You have to have speed limits. You have to gauge, we have to have uniform gauges. In other words, in the South, railroad tracks were, 4 feet, 8 inches wide apart. That's their gauge. Throughout the rest of the nation, it was 5'2". So Southern railroad cars would not run on Northern railroad tracks. And Northern railroad cars would not run on Southern railroad tracks. And this aided in monopolies. No, the Hepburn Act said you got to have the same gauge throughout the United States, a uniform gauge. It set the times. In other words, having time zones in America, that comes from the railroads. And the railroads demanded that so we wouldn't have head-on collision anymore. If you're on East Coast time, that's not going to be the same time as it is on the West Coast. Well, that came from the railroads. The Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act. One after another, after another, after another. Strong note, all these mean the growth of government because the people wanted that. So again, Roosevelt, who has the strong reputation of identifying with the little guy, with having a government that is responsive to the will of the people, that always puts him in our top 5 presidents, almost invariably our top 5 presidents, always, always, always our top 10. Now I have on there a bullet point. He tries to improve race relations. He invited 2 African Americans to the White House on different occasions, Washington Carver and W.E.B. Du Bois. It's supposed to be Du Bois, but he always said, no, it's Du Bois. D-U-B-O-I-S. Well, Washington Carver was a scientist, a chemist. He had many, many, many important inventions and developments. And so everybody recognized at the time that he was a genius, a chemist as a genius. And so Theodore Roosevelt invited him to the White House to talk to him. W.E.B. Du Bois was the founder of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That was W.E.B. Du Bois. Strong note here. Roosevelt had to face a lot of negative reaction within the Republican Party, his own party. His own party reacted very negatively to this. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is genuinely unfortunate. So here's a president trying to reach out to African Americans who had no political advocates at all since Lincoln, and Lincoln always kind of distanced himself from African American political activists during the war. For example, he never met with Frederick Douglass, never. He always avoided him on the streets. So here we have Theodore Roosevelt actually reaching out to the African American community, but the Republican Party said no. And I'm sorry to say that Roosevelt responded to that. He said, okay, you know what? I'll stop reaching out to African Americans, and that is unfortunate. He was enough of a politician by this time to understand that if the Republican Party, if the broader Republican Party was against reaching out, was still racist, if you will, was against reaching out to African Americans, then he would not do it, and that's unfortunate. Now, again, his nephew, FDR, will kind of do the same thing, but his niece, Eleanor Roosevelt, we will run into her later. She will go against the flow, and she'll reach out to the African American community, but we will talk about that later. Now, he will reach out to William Howard Taft, who is his vice president. And he says to William Howard Taft, you're going to be the next president. So again, this is a political dynamic that happens again and again and again and again. This is the longest string of that sort of thing happening. McKinley picked Roosevelt, and then Roosevelt's going to pick Taft. And so we have a vice president following a president. And it happened 3 times in a row. And that's the longest period that we ever had that sort of thing happen in American political history. So with that in mind, let's talk about William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft, a Republican from Ohio, his term 1909 to 1913. So if you'll look, he's only in for 4 years. He's a one-term president. Now, William Howard Taft, in his background, he had always been a lawyer. I think Columbia law. He had always been a lawyer, and a very, very good one. In terms of his view of the law and the Constitution, he's fairly progressive, but he also agrees with a fairly strict interpretation of the Constitution. So he's a very strong constitutionalist. I think that's important. Politically, he's going to come up through the national political hierarchy. He'll have a series of government positions under various presidents, and he worked his way up. Under McKinley, he will be one of the first governors of a newly acquired colony, which will be the Philippines. He was the governor of the Philippines for a few years. So he is trying to be, even if he is a lawyer, he's trying to be a man of the people. I suppose those two things can go together, and he tried it. He's very personable. He's very friendly and outgoing. He didn't have very many personal friends, but he was very, very friendly and outgoing and very easy to get along with. Strong note here, he did not want to be the president. He did not want to be the president. And he kept saying that. What he wanted was to be on the Supreme Court. And as it turns out, that will happen. He'll be put on the Supreme Court by Wilson. It's one of the last things that Wilson will do is put William Howard Taft on the Supreme Court. And he'll be on the Supreme Court from 1921 as Chief Justice until 1930 when he died. He's the only president ever to have done that. Perfectly constitutional. There's nothing wrong with it. But he went to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt went to him and said, listen, you're going to be the next president. He said, I don't want to do that. But Roosevelt talked him into it. So along came the election. Roosevelt is out there campaigning hard for William Howard Taft, and Taft gets elected. Again, he's running against William Jennings Bryan. Had a brain freeze there for a moment. He's running against William Jennings Bryan, and nobody wanted William Jennings Bryan on the Democratic side. So he's elected. Now, a little bit of a note, and this is kind of on Roosevelt. When Taft was elected, Roosevelt said, listen, I've got to get away from here. I got to check out. Otherwise, people are going to look at your decisions, at William Howard Taft's decisions, and go running to me, Roosevelt, asking if that's the right decision or not. And he said, I don't want that. I want you to have your own presidency. Again, this is very thoughtful, very insightful on Roosevelt's part. So Roosevelt said, I'm going to go to Africa. And he did. He got on board a ship, went out and got a bunch of guns, got all sorts of like camping equipment, and off he went to Africa. And evidently, he shot everything that moved in Africa and ate most of it. Somebody asked him one time, did he shoot a Nile crocodile? And he said, yes, I did. How did it taste? And he said, bully. I have no idea what that means. When he got back from Africa, months and months and months later, he built a great big gigantic home in upstate New York called Sagamore. And if you're ever in Sagamore, which means House of the Great Chief, go to it, and it is just a big, giant collection of stuffed African animals. It's all the animals he shot. Elephants and giraffes and wildebeest and God knows what all. So he didn't build Sagamore to live in, which is Teddy Roosevelt's second wife. I don't know what she thought about that, but it is a big, gigantic collection of all the animals that he shot. So he's out, and Taft is in. Roosevelt is out, Taft is in. Strong note now, he implies these antitrust laws with vigor. That means he really went after the monopolies. Where McKinley gets a reputation for breaking up these monopolies, and Roosevelt actually gets the reputation for doing it, it is actually Taft. Taft broke up more monopolies than McKinley and Roosevelt combined. 12 years of two presidents who were progressives, but Taft outdid them all. Because he is a lawyer, he knows what laws to get Congress to pass. He knows how to take the laws that are on the books and enforce them. And so Taft is big on breaking up these monopolies. So we find, strong note here, indirectly, this improves the economy tremendously. We find that with competition reintroduced into the system, that the economy begins to level out. We still have a lot of growth because of the growth of technology, especially the automobile and later on electrification. And we will talk about that. But the economy starts to level out. We don't have all these booms and busts. Certainly there will be busts. Think of the Great Depression. But it's not going to be like it was in the 19th century. So economically, this worked perfectly. It's exactly what we would have anticipated. Very quickly here, the 16th Amendment. This is the income tax. Now, an income tax had been tried before under Lincoln to help finance the Civil War. But Lincoln found very quickly that the infrastructure was not there in the 1860s to support an income tax. In order for an income tax to work, the employer and the employee have to have verifiable records on what the employee is making. Furthermore, these records have to be available. Back in those days, the income tax was going to be collected once a quarter. Now we don't have to do it once a year, thank God. But back in those days, you had to pay your income tax once every 4 months. You had to pay. But the infrastructure in the early 20th century was there for an income tax. Listen to me carefully. By passing an income tax, which is perfectly constitutional, Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 1, Congress shall have the power to tax. An income tax is perfectly constitutional. But a man of Taft's legal background wanted to make sure that he had full consent, full approval, if you will, of the Constitution before he tried an income tax. And so they passed an amendment. How on earth are you going to make a new tax palatable to the people? Well, this is William Howard Taft. He did this. And the progressives, as it turns out. You tell everybody you're going to stick it to the rich. Now, this is the era of those huge, giant moguls. You know, Carnegie, John Pierpont Morgan was just starting in the banking industry. But you had Carnegie out there. You had Rockefeller. He was still alive, and he was making a vast treasure of money. And you tell everybody in America, this is how we're going to get money out of the hands of the rich. So there were two problems with a laissez-faire economic model. Problem one, boom and bust economy. And we've solved that. We reintroduced competition into the workplace, and that leveled out the economy. The other problem with the laissez-faire economic model is the money gets trapped at the top. And by passing an income tax, that is solved. We could stick it to the rich. We could tax a lot of that money out of their hands. Now, some of you will jump to a conclusion. Well, this is Robin Hood. You're taking from the rich and giving to the poor. No, you're not. You're taking from the rich and you're going out and building a bigger navy, a more modern navy. And so that puts people to work. You're building more infrastructure. You're replacing railroads. And so that puts people to work. You're putting in all sorts of other infrastructure. You're putting in meat inspectors. You're putting in agencies and hospitals that could do research to find medical solutions to common problems. And this requires money. And so you're putting doctors and pharmacists to work. And so this is how it works. This is how our economy works, at least a significant part of it. You take taxpayer money and you put people to work. They earn the money that they get. So by telling everybody we're going to tax the crap out of the rich, everybody said, hell yes, then we'll have an income tax. Among the rich, this is actually true. Among the rich, this became a status symbol. There was actually a cartoon at the time saying, this one woman, rich, wealthy, elite woman, clearly in the cartoon, was saying to another rich, wealthy, elite woman, well, my husband's rich enough to have to pay an income tax. And the other woman has to hang her head a little bit. Aw, her husband's not that rich. Now, of course, it doesn't stay that way for long. By the 1920s, the rich are saying, what? We're paying all the bills? No, heck no. Put it on the middle class. But we have an amendment that provides an income tax, and this means, strong note here, the long-term impact, government can grow. We now have an infinite amount of money to be able to get into the government, and government can grow. So really dating from the early 1900s, we have the government that we understand today. It's not that huge. Our government is still not that big. But government can grow. The 17th Amendment, very quickly, is the direct election of senators. Up to that time, the states had been deciding how they were going to have 2 state senators. 2 senators per state. Well, it was up to the states to figure out how they were going to actually do that. Some of the states left it up to the governor entirely, that it was the governor's choice to who he was going to appoint as the state senator. And usually there's a lot of deal making, a lot of cronyism. Sometimes this was a matter of nepotism. You could appoint a family member. In other states, it was the lieutenant governor. He could also be the senator. In others, it was a member elected from the state House of Representatives and the state Senate. That elected representatives, out of that group of elected representatives, would elect another representative. And that would be your state senator. But this was the result of a long-term progressive dynamic. The progressives, again, Vox Populi, wanted the direct election of senators. That way, ladies and gentlemen, the senators are directly responsible to the people. Direct election of senators. The senators are now, as they have been since the 17th Amendment, they are directly responsible to the people. Now, the next few of these, they just indicate the growth of government. Creates a Department of Labor. In other words, strikes are suddenly, they're perfectly all right. You can have strikes. But the Department of Labor is also going to set safety standards. They're going to get children out of the workforce. They're going to make, they're going to even up the score a little bit, if you will. They're going to have regulations in place saying, you can't do the things that monopolies were able to do. You can't have a company town that's going to rip off all the workers. You can't have that anymore. Expands the civil service. This simply means bureaucrats. But hopefully, ladies and gentlemen, this means bureaucrats in a positive way. In other words, to have an income tax, you also have to have an Internal Revenue Service. And the Internal Revenue Service is nothing but accountants who check the records. That's all they do. But you have to have a lot of them, especially at the time, as I pointed out before, that you have to pay your taxes 4 times a year. So you had to have an Internal Revenue Service to make sure that everybody was on the up and up. That records were being sent to the government saying this is what a person made. And then the person filing his income tax is saying, well, yeah, this is what I made. Especially, ladies and gentlemen, when we're talking about the rich, wealthy, and elite. So the policies indirectly initiates a shift in the Republican Party planks. Now, what I mean here is that the Republicans are looking at this and they're going, wow, we're getting everything that we wanted. But government is getting really, really big. It's starting to get out of control. And Republicans, including William Howard Taft, are saying we've gone too far, too fast. These policies of expanding the government indirectly shift the Republican Party. They're saying now government is too big. It's getting out of control. Things are getting too hot within government. We've got to slow down. And that trends towards conservatism. Please write that down. William Howard Taft will have 6 Supreme Court appointments. That means he has an influence for a long, long period of time. And later on, he'll be on the Supreme Court, as you well know. He admits New Mexico and Arizona. That completes the lower 48. We will get Hawaii and Alaska in the 1950s. He admitted New Mexico and Arizona. They finally got their 30,000 voters, and then they got their 60,000 voters. They formed a government, and they went right through the steps necessary in the Northwest Ordinance 1787 to become states, and so they become states. But here's the critical element. About 2/3 of the way through his administration, he changes his personal philosophy from progressive to conservative. I had a cartoon on that first lead-in slide where William Howard Taft is holding a great big giant ink pen, and on the ink pen it says conservatism. And then you see all the people around him cheering and saying yes. In other words, think this all the way through. Through part of Grover Cleveland, then McKinley, then all of Roosevelt, and a large part of Taft's administration, we had extremely active presidents. And this meant that the press was going mad every day, debating all these new laws and debating what the government meant and debating how these things were going to play in the American public. And so the people were ready for the government to slow down. William Howard Taft responds to that by going from left, listen to me, he goes from middle left to middle, and a little bit right. If we think of our politics as a scale, all the way on the left, that's people that, they're liberals who want to go live in a tent and, not have anything and have all these various liberties, but also government protection. To all the way on the right, and that's people who want, money involved in business, money involved in government. They want the government to be strong in the states and weak in the central government. And so very, very conservative, a strict interpretation of the Constitution. So in between those had been William Howard Taft. And he was kind of in the middle on the left, not extreme left, in the middle. But he turns to the center and just a little bit right. And this caught Teddy Roosevelt's attention, which is the next to the last note, the last bullet point that I have up there. This is unfortunate for Taft. He did not have very many personal friends. And Teddy Roosevelt had always been a close personal friend. But Roosevelt saw Taft as changing to conservative from progressive, and he began to bitterly attack Taft. And Taft reportedly cried real tears over this. He's a very sensitive man. And he wept over the fact that TR was no longer his friend, and that TR was criticizing him in the way he was. But this leads to a political battle, which is the very next slide. So TR is going to run for re-election again. Now bear in mind, Grover Cleveland had had a split administration. So the people were not adverse to that. And Teddy Roosevelt was still young and strong and vigorous. Somebody asked him one time, do you feel like you're up for another political challenge? And Roosevelt said, I'm as fit as a bull moose. And so it became the Bull Moose Party. So let's talk about that. William Howard Taft, I mentioned before, he's going to be on the Supreme Court, but that's for the future. Let's talk about the Bull Moose Party. Now, the Bull Moose Party. Again, we have another, I think this is a late Thomas Nast cartoon. Thomas Nast was probably really close to, he was very old at the time. And in the upper left, you have the latest arrival at the political zoo. And there's Teddy Roosevelt. You can see him with his glasses, this big, giant, toothy smile. He was very famous for that. And the other two animals in the political stable are the donkey and the elephant, and they're all beat up. They got black eyes. They're all beat all the crap out of. And there is this young, healthy, strong bull moose. In the second slide, right next to it there, kind of on the right, you see the bull moose, the progressives. They're galloping towards Congress. And Teddy Roosevelt says, my hat is still in the ring. That means I am still politically active. In that lower cartoon, you find out exactly what goes on here. And this is really all I really want you guys to get out of this entire slide. When Roosevelt, who's riding a bull moose, runs, he really splits the Republican ticket. The Bull Moose Party is really going to be a fan club for Roosevelt. But the Republican establishment is still William Howard Taft, who is riding the elephant in that cartoon. And this allows a Democrat, in this case Woodrow Wilson, to get ahead, which is exactly what happened. The Bull Moose Party will split the Republican ticket, part going to Roosevelt and part going to William Howard Taft. And this allowed the Democratic Party, who otherwise did not really have a chance, to win election. So what Roosevelt is really saying is that the progressives still have a great deal to do. There's still a great deal that they want to do. So the Bull Moose Party, their origins are in the Greenback Party. Your book will talk about that a lot. And they had an income tax. Well, that's what the Greenback Party wanted. They got that. Direct election of senators, they got that. An 8-hour workday, they had gotten that. Women's suffrage, they did not get that. So Roosevelt says, listen, there's still all of these issues that the people want. And so he says, I'm going to run as a bull moose, as a progressive. Now, the bottom, underline, the bottom bullet point, that says it all. The bull moose only lasts as long as Teddy Roosevelt lasted. It split the Republican Party, which put Wilson in charge. And then the Bull Moose Party goes away. And that's all I really want you guys to get out of this slide. So let's go on to the last slide, which talks about the political parties at the end of the progressive era. The political party planks at the end of the progressive era. The Republican Party. They are, as we know them today, a weak central government. The Democratic Party, they switch, especially under Wilson, who will be transitional. We'll talk about Wilson later on. He's outside of the progressive era, so we're not going to put him here. The Democratic Party switch, and they say, no, we want a strong central government. The Republican Party, states' rights. The Democratic Party, an embryonic socialism. They're like, listen, the government can do good things for the common man. So again, the Democratic Party, they're taking over a party plank that had always belonged to the Republican Party, and the Whigs even before that, an appeal to the common man, where the Republican Party appeals to big business and the upper middle class. The Republican Party, laissez-faire, but they're willing to go with a modified laissez-faire. There can be some rules and some government involvement. The Republican Party is insisting on a strict interpretation of the Constitution. The Democratic Party, and that's the way it is today, they have a loose interpretation of the Constitution. In other words, it provides guidelines, but the government can do a lot more than what the Constitution says. The one I really want to draw your attention to is going to be the issue that really dominates politics into the next 20 years of American history. That is to say, throughout the years of the First World War, then the 1920s, and then the 1930s when we see the rise of these dictators. So isolationism will become a political issue that it had never been before. Are we going to be strongly isolationist, which is what the Republican Party says, at the end of the progressive era? Or are we only going to be moderately isolationist? There are regimes out there that we want to get rid of. So we'll step in when we have to. And that's what the Democrats are saying. They hesitate a long ways to step into anybody else's business. But the Republicans, they're pretty strongly isolationist, like saying, no, 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 don't do that. America first. So isolationism will be an important issue later on. Yes? So that concludes all I have to say on the progressive era. I talked about getting the law caught up with industrialization with the Sherman Antitrust Act. Then I talked about the Supreme Court cases, which are important, and then the presidents and politics during the progressive era, which is really critical. Progressivism is a political issue. So at the end of this political change, the progressive era, the party switched, and that was during the Taft administration. He dragged the Republican Party slightly to the right, to center right, and so the Democrats, they become, under Wilson especially, more left. Thank you for your attention on this, and I will see you in the next presentation, which will be American Imperialism.